I'm Jarrett Carpenter, and this is the Future Signal podcast. On this episode, I want to dive into why 99% of people will never own 1/10 of a Bitcoin or 0.1 BTC. Let's dive right in. These are the three reasons that I'm thinking about. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, go ahead and check out the show notes. Go over and watch it on YouTube. I'm going to leave the YouTube link in the show notes. This entire thing is basically a presentation with a lot of visuals. Because I'm a visual learner, it's just easier, I think, for me to wrap my head around some of these larger concepts if they're in visuals. So if you're also into visuals, go check out the YouTube. The three reasons. One of them is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. One of them is economics. One of them is digital scarcity. Okay? These play a role in what I'm calling the lack of conviction cycle. So what is fear, uncertainty, and doubt? Basically Bitcoin haters. What are the economic things I'm talking about here when I say economics? Basically the macro and the micro. What's macro? You have inflation and currency debasement. Those are two big trends. And then the micro is just poor personal budgeting, poor personal finance. The macro is also making things so expensive that people just don't have enough money. So because they have no conviction because of all the haters and they don't know what to think about Bitcoin, then they're not putting in enough money. And finally, digital scarcity. There's just not a lot of Bitcoin out there. So getting 0.1 is going to kind of be difficult and make it tough to get to 0.1 BTC. FUD. People are too skeptical of Bitcoin to ever spend what 0.1 will cost before it becomes too out of reach for them. When I say out of reach, I think about getting to 0.1 Bitcoin like chasing an ice cream truck. And the ice cream truck is already 100 yards away and going at 12 miles per hour, which is pretty fast. So even if you sprint to catch up to it, it's going to continue to accelerate because every 100 yards, in this weird analogy about an ice cream truck, it's speeding up by 1 mile per hour. And humans can only run so fast. So when it comes to FUD, I think people don't necessarily know what to think because of these particular narratives, these particular fear, uncertainty, and doubt narratives. Bitcoin is a scam. It's too volatile. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's only for illicit activity. I've already missed the boat or the ice cream truck. And what if the government bans it? Okay. So because people don't have clarity around it, once again, going back to the lack of conviction cycle, they don't have any clarity around it. So they have zero conviction or not enough conviction. Then because of the economics, they don't have enough money. And finally, they're not able to get the 0.1 Bitcoin. So we've already touched upon FUD. I think that's pretty simple. And I'm going to do my best to explain the economic and the digital scarcity. So let's dive in. Economics. Basically, people don't have enough money to pay their bills. Forget getting to 0.1 Bitcoin. Since the pandemic, things have become very expensive. Most prices have gone up like 15 to 20%. And then from that massive increase from the pandemic, year over year, they're still increasing at like 3%, which may not seem like a lot, but a lot of people are feeling it, and it actually is a lot, right? So the economics. I wanted to share this. This says that most Americans can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense. This actually came out in January 2025, but there are tons of reports, even from the Federal Reserve, that just talk about how Americans in the most wealthy country on the planet, right? The average American, the average citizen there does not have enough money to cover a $1,000 emergency. How many? It says only 41% of Americans said they would be able to tap into their savings to cover an unexpected $1,000 expense. That means that 59% can't. And I wanted to use that to kind of level set here, because if people in the US can't do it, how are people in the rest of the world? Because the United States is only about 4 to 5% of the global population, and it's supposed to be the land of opportunity, the land where people have access to be able to get things that they want or things that they perceive that they need. And Bitcoin is forever becoming one of those things. So if 40% of people stateside if only 41% of people stateside, I should say, could afford a $1,000 emergency, how are they ever going to afford 9.6K investment into Bitcoin or buy of Bitcoin? Throughout this episode, I want to refer to Bitcoin's price as 96,000. It's going to be the easiest. It's hovering around there somewhere right now on February 23rd as I record this. That $9.6 thousand, right? $9,600 is basically the current price for 0.1 Bitcoin. But once again, if 41% of stateside people could afford a $1,000 emergency, they're still $8,600 away. And the amount of people that would have that liquid or be able to just have that on hand to maybe put into Bitcoin is a far, far lower number. I don't get into that. I want to stay on more broad brushstrokes on this, but let's continue to dive into the economics. So because people probably don't have the 9.6 $1,000 they need to be able to buy 1/10 of a Bitcoin. I started to ask the question, how many people globally as a percent could buy $100 weekly to stack Bitcoin? And if they did that, how long would this take to get to 0.1? Now, in order to do this, I first wanted to kind of dive into some of the global bank numbers here. And it says the median income around the world is $10,000 annually or $192 a week. Okay. And this is pre-tax, right? So if it's already $192 a week, and once again, I chose $100 as an arbitrary round number that maybe people could use to try to buy pieces of Bitcoin so that way over time they get access to 0.1 Bitcoin. But the World Bank is saying the median income is $10,000 annually. So that's not the average. And we can't use the average when we talk about median incomes because there's so many wealthy people, even like a couple thousand billionaires that pull everyone up. So we're using median being the number that's in the middle of the data set, right? If we think back to middle school or whenever you learn that. So we're going to use median, but that's only $10,000 annually. And it's actually $400 off the amount you would need to put into Bitcoin today at $96,000 to get your 1/10 of a Bitcoin. I go on to stay here in the global income distribution that many people in developing countries earn way below this. I'm currently in Colombia where the average salary in Colombia, the minimum salary, I should say, that many people make is only about $350 a month, right? So it's even lower than this World Bank median income, which says it's about $833 a month or $192 a week or $10,000 annually, right? Only a fraction of the world's population can actually comfortably spend $100 per week or $5,200 per year on Bitcoin. Inflation has been eroding purchasing power worldwide, especially in countries with high currency devaluation. Another one of the macroeconomic impacts. And here's the example of, Argentina, Turkey, and Nigeria. So I wanted to start to estimate the percent of people who can buy $100 weekly. Once again, I chose $100 because it's a round number and it was easy to honestly create a model with. So I was trying to wrap my head around the percent amount of people who could actually buy $100 weekly. And these are the numbers I've come up with, right? Based on the global earners. If you make more than $34,000 annually, you are in the top 10% of earners. If you make more than $18,000 annually, you are in the top 20%. And then finally, there's the bottom 80% where we're getting closer to abject poverty. We're getting closer to people who are just going to be struggling, who unfortunately are probably never going to be able to have the opportunity to get 1/10 of Bitcoin. And so when you break that number down, right, estimating who can buy $100 weekly, the top 10% or the top 20%, the top 10% can likely afford it comfortably. The top 20%, which is around 1.6 billion people, if we're assuming there's around 8 billion people on the planet, then they can afford it, but with some budgeting, or you can read in sacrifices. And then finally, the bottom 80% is highly unlikely to ever be able to afford this. So I'm really focused, however, on the top 10%, because the top 20%, now you're starting to get into countries where people are dealing with currency devaluation, and it's just going to be very, very difficult if your currency is devaluating at 5 to 10%, if not 20% a year, to ever be able to catch that ice cream truck to get the 0.1. So I'm thinking about the top 10%, or around 800 million people, if we're assuming there's 8 billion people on the planet, are ever going to even be able to pay the $100 a week to start to, DCA or buy pieces of Bitcoin consistently to be able to hopefully get up to 0.1. And once again, that's a very arbitrary number, the 100. I just chose that because it was easy to kind of create models with. So if you bought $100 of Bitcoin weekly, how long would it take to get 0.1 BTC? In order to do this, I have what I'm calling $100 weekly buy assumptions. I had to create these assumptions in order to be able to kind of create this model for us to kind of use to see how long it would take. First of all, I'm saying that Bitcoin price is starting at 96,000. That's the number we're going to use throughout this episode. And it's going to remain there throughout the 2025. That's just going to make it easier. Now, the price of Bitcoin could double. It could go down to 60,000 from where it is today. We're just using that as the assumption. The other assumption is that the Bitcoin price will increase 30% annually. Now, that's not a random number. That's a number that Michael Saylor laid out when he was at Bitcoin Conference Nashville in 2024, saying that over the next 21 years, Bitcoin, per his models, is going to be appreciating at 30% compound annual growth, right? So that is what Michael has said. So we're going to use that. And then finally, like I said, there are no dips to influence the DCA or the consistent buy, and you never miss a week to buy Bitcoin. Now, all of these assumptions are going to form the following data, and I realize that they are ridiculous, but it's going to be the easiest way for us to wrap our head around this. If you did that and you bought $100 of Bitcoin weekly all throughout 2025, right, it would take you 111 weeks. So all throughout 2025, all throughout 2026, into 2027. Okay. And this is what this breaks down to. In 2025, starting in the first week of January, you would be buying at the price of Bitcoin would be 96,000. However, in 2026, we're assuming that 30% increase, right? That 30% increase is that ice cream truck speeding up that 1 mile per hour every 100 yards, right? So that way in 2026, the price would be 124,800. Okay. We're going to buy that for 52 weeks. And then finally, only for 7 weeks up until February 2027, we would be buying Bitcoin at $162,240. So $162,240. That would give us the 111 weeks. It would allow us to get more than 0.1 Bitcoin, and it would have an average weekly buy of 0.000902 Bitcoin. So if you're watching this and you're interested in getting 0.1 Bitcoin, you could look at this math and say, that seems reasonable. There's a lot of assumptions here. So Bitcoin price could easily go up to 200,000, in which case it would then take you a lot longer. You could also use less than $100 and maybe use $25 or $50 weekly or even $10 weekly. And it's going to take you orders of magnitude actually longer. So if you assume, let me see this. Yeah, so I say, I chose $100 as an arbitrary and round amount to DCA weekly. DCA is dollar cost average. Basically a fancy term saying to buy the same amount in US dollar amount of Bitcoin, regardless of the Bitcoin price weekly. And then I say here though, if you lower that amount, it will take more time. So instead of putting in $100, let's say you put in $50, then it's not going to just take you 111 weeks, right? Nor is it going to take you double that. It's not going to take you 222 because, okay, we've cut the amount we're putting in by half. Therefore, it's going to take double to result in 0.1 Bitcoin. Because of the assumption that Bitcoin is speeding up at 30% annually, it will likely take you much, much longer than just doubling the time that it would take with 100, right? Because the ice cream truck is speeding up. Now, beyond time and money is Bitcoin scarcity, which we are going to dive into next. But hopefully this economics basically that it's not easy to get. Most people don't have $100 to even invest weekly. And even if they do, it will take them 111 weeks. That's assuming that they consistently buy and they don't have any of their own world emergencies, life emergencies, and need that money. It also assumes that they're not going to sell some of the Bitcoin they've put in as they see it increase in value. They need to leave that in. A lot of assumptions here. Going back to the lack of conviction, we've now talked about the FUD, the Bitcoin haters, right? They're going to bring you no conviction. So then you're not going to put in enough money. And you're probably not going to put in enough money, even if you have conviction, just because you may not have that money. Times are tough. Finally, that's why it's going to be tough to get 0.1 Bitcoin. Let's continue on and talk about digital scarcity. Digital scarcity. Bitcoin is so scarce that having 0.1 Bitcoin will have you in the 1%. That is the exact premise of this episode, and I hope to show you that number at the end. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. So we're going to go ahead and unpack some things. 19.8 million Bitcoin have already been mined, meaning they've been processed through the Bitcoin network and they're out in circulation, or they've been put out, I should say, in circulation. However, of those, around 3 to 5 million have been lost. When you forget your private keys to a wallet that you custody, your Bitcoin's gone. It's cryptographically locked. You're not going to get it back. Okay. Finally, we still have 1.2 million Bitcoin left to mine, but that will take 100 plus years, and the last Bitcoin will be mined in 2140. So while there still are more Bitcoin to be mined, let's focus today on the circulating supply, which is around 6 million BTC, and let's unpack this a little bit more. Bitcoin's distribution is crazy. Satoshi alone holds 1.1 million Bitcoin. Top holders control 3 million plus Bitcoin. And then exchanges, institutions, and governments own millions more. Let's dive into that. Public companies own around 650 Bitcoin. A lot of these are mining companies, and MicroStrategy owns like 430,000 of that 650, and MicroStrategy is buying more Bitcoin seemingly weekly. Governments hold around 512K Bitcoin, led by China and the United States. China and the United States have actually never bought Bitcoin. They've only confiscated it away, but they still own a lot of Bitcoin from those confiscations. Private companies hold around 430,000 Bitcoin. The Bitcoin ETFs hold 1.4 million Bitcoin, which is truly crazy because ETFs were only approved about a year ago, and they already own 1.4 million Bitcoin, which is, 6 or 7% of the total supply ever. And then it's a little bit more than that of the supply that's ever been mined. DeFi and smart contracts hold around 200K Bitcoin. So all of this takes around 3.1 million Bitcoin from circulation. So we're left with around 3 million Bitcoin in circulation, with the 1.2 million, which is left to mine, which will take up to the year 2140. Okay. 3 million Bitcoin in circulation. Let's look at what that is. For 3 million Bitcoin divided by 8 billion people, which we're using as the global population, that means if it were divided equally, every single person on Earth would only get 0.000375 Bitcoin per person. And 0.000375 is 266 times away from 0.1, which is why I've always felt that if you own 0.1 Bitcoin, you're doing pretty well, I think. And this is why I say, you're probably in the 1%. But the real question that we want to get to, and I'm excited to share with you, is how many wallets, active wallets today, have 0.1 Bitcoin? And we have a pretty good idea of this from stuff on chain. So before we get there, though, I want to remind us of something. I want to remind us of the economics. I want to remind us of when we said, who could buy $100 even weekly? Who could even afford that? And out of the 8 billion people, we said it was 800 million people. So I guess I'm trying to propose that maybe 800 million people could week on week for a couple of years be consistent and buy, so that way they get 0.1 Bitcoin. That's 800 million. Do I think it's 800 million? Like I said, I don't think it is. I think it's actually a much smaller number of people who have $100 weekly to put into Bitcoin. Not only then do they have to be able to have that money, but once again, we go back to the conviction cycle. Do they understand it enough? Do they feel convicted enough to say, hey, I'm going to put this money on the sideline and not spend it to go to the movies or get some new clothes or go on a vacation? Okay. I hope you're ready. Let's look at how many wallets actually hold 0.1 Bitcoin. This is from Bitcoin Magazine Pro. Bitcoin Magazine is one of the best media publications in Bitcoin, and they have an entire website where you can go on and kind of play around, and they have all of these stats. But if you go on and you look, it's around 4.5 million wallets, okay, have Bitcoin addresses with more than 0.1 Bitcoin, with a tenth of a Bitcoin. So here we are talking about maybe 800 million people globally, right? If we go back, 800 million people globally maybe have the ability to do this. Maybe you could argue it's 1.6 billion if they start budgeting. But in the reality today, it's 4.5 million wallets have more than 0.1 Bitcoin. What percentage of the world is 4.5 million people? 4.5 million divided by 8 billion is 0.0005625. 0.0005625 is far smaller than 0.01 or 1%. So you, in my opinion, if you have 0.1 BTC today, you are in the uber 1% of all the people on the planet who own Bitcoin, and just in general. And to be more specific, it's 0.0005625 people on the planet have more than 0.1 Bitcoin in a wallet. And I wanted to share this because I was kind of blown away. I was like, 4.5 million people. How many people is that? I feel like there are more cities around the world, and there's actually around 111, not just cities, but urban areas like the metropolitan areas. There's 111, but I figured I'd list the top 20 here. Cities where there's way more than 4.5 million. The city I'm currently in Bogota, is on that list, and there's around 10 million people. So here's a list of people. So there's entire cities right? The amount of people that own 0.1 Bitcoin could easily fit in 111 cities, right? Which is crazy. And I also want to call this out. I have a huge asterisk here because while this is just wallet addresses, that doesn't mean that it's 4.5 million individual people. That's an assumption. Many people in Bitcoin have multiple wallets, and they may have multiple wallets that have more than 0.1 Bitcoin, which means it's likely less than 4.5 million, meaning you're likely even more in the Uber, like tenth of a 100th%, right? Which is getting crazy. Going back to the lack of conviction cycle, there's too much FUD. There's too many people saying it's a Ponzi scheme to have conviction. Then there's not enough people that have the money to be able to get 0.1 Bitcoin. To kind of finish this idea, I've called this the Bitcoin FOMO cycle. It looks very similar, but it's basically, this is the circle that we're on and that Bitcoin has been on since it started. And this is the adoption cycle in as many ways. You get FOMO, and then you want to buy Bitcoin. And then as you buy Bitcoin and more people buy Bitcoin, the price increases, right? As the price increases, it becomes way more scarce, which then the FOMO increases again. People go to buy Bitcoin, the price increases. You can see how this goes. The ice cream truck, it's speeding up. You have to catch it. It's at 12 miles per hour, which is pretty fast. You have to catch it in 100 yards before it gets to its next 100 yards, because then it's going to 13 miles per hour, 14 miles per hour every 100 yards. That is where we are when it comes to 0.1 BTC today. It is something that very few people on the planet. We saw the addresses. It was 4.5 million. As I said, yes, it's 4.5 million, but many people in Bitcoin have multiple wallets. Miners, they have tons of different wallets while they're mining. So it may not go into all one wallet. It could be one miner with 8 different wallets that all have more than 0.1 Bitcoin. I hope that you enjoyed this episode on why 0.1 Bitcoin for me is the new 1% and why 99% of people on Earth will never, ever be able to attain it, have it, own it, acquire it. If you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and subscribe, whether you're listening to it on YouTube or you're watching on YouTube or listening to us on a podcast platform. And be sure to follow us on socials at Future Signal Pod. You can always check out our website at futuresignal.xyz. I hope that you enjoyed this. And my one ask is that you share this with someone else, because I don't think enough people understand that the ice cream truck is speeding up. And if you want to get on the train or catch the ice cream truck, you got to start soon. Thanks so much for checking out this episode, and I will see you next time.